Between 1962 and 1973, one of the most audacious and controversial construction projects in American history transformed the skyline of New York City and marked the final chapter of a family dynasty that had shaped the nation for nearly a century. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, rising 110 stories above Lower Manhattan, were not merely buildings, but monuments to power, ambition, and the ability of a wealthy family to bend government institutions, financial markets, and urban planning to their will. This is the story of how David Rockefeller, the youngest grandson of America's first billionaire, conceived a vision to save Lower Manhattan and protect his banking empire, and how he and his brother Nelson, the governor of New York, orchestrated a decade-long campaign to make that vision reality. It is a story of displaced shopkeepers and dead construction workers, of engineering marvels and safety compromises, of political machinations and public protests. Most importantly, it is the story of why these towers came to be known as the Rockefeller's last empire, the final monument of a family whose influence was already fading even as their greatest architectural achievement rose toward the sky, representing both the peak and the end of an era when American dynasties could remake cities in their own image. Continue this video. Before, please like, comment, share, and subscribe this channel. The origin of the World Trade Center idea and David Rockefeller's original vision in 1962. In the early months of 1962, as winter began to loosen its grip on Manhattan, a vision was taking shape in the mind of one of America's most powerful bankers that would forever transform the skyline of New York City. David Rockefeller, the youngest grandson of the legendary oil tycoon John D. Rockefeller, sat in his office at the Chase Manhattan Bank headquarters in Lower Manhattan, gazing out at the struggling waterfront district that surrounded him. What he saw troubled him deeply. The streets were lined with aging warehouses, obsolete shipping facilities, and deteriorating 19th century buildings that seemed frozen in time while the rest of Manhattan marched confidently into the modern era. The area known as Radio Row, a chaotic cluster of small electronics shops and businesses, occupied valuable real estate that David believed could serve a far greater purpose. As he looked out over this urban landscape, an audacious idea crystallized in his mind, an idea so ambitious that it would eventually be called the last great project of the Rockefeller Empire, a monument not just to commerce but to the family's enduring vision of reshaping American cities according to their grand design. David Rockefeller had not arrived at this moment by chance. Born in 1915 into unimaginable wealth and privilege, he had grown up in a family that saw itself as stewards of American progress, responsible for using their vast fortune to shape the nation's future. His grandfather, John D. Rockefeller Sr., had built Standard Oil into one of the most powerful monopolies in history, accumulating wealth that would be worth hundreds of billions in today's dollars. But the Rockefellers were more than just wealthy. They were builders of institutions, founders of universities, patrons of the arts, and architects of urban development. David's father, John D. Rockefeller Jr., had already left an indelible mark on Manhattan by financing the construction of Rockefeller Center during the Great Depression, a magnificent complex of Art Deco buildings that had become a symbol of New York's resilience and ambition. Now, as David assumed leadership of the family's interests, he felt the weight of this legacy pressing upon him, urging him to create something equally transformative, something that would cement the Rockefeller name in the physical fabric of New York for generations to come. The genesis of what would become the World Trade Center can be traced to a specific concern that plagued David Rockefeller throughout the late 1950s and early 1960s. He had invested heavily in Lower Manhattan, most notably by constructing the new Chase Manhattan Bank headquarters at 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza, a gleaming skyscraper that opened in 1961 and represented the bank's commitment to the financial district. But David quickly realized that his beautiful new building stood like an island of modernity in a sea of decay. The surrounding neighborhood was hemorrhaging businesses and residents, losing economic vitality to Midtown Manhattan, where newer office buildings, better transportation links, and more attractive amenities were drawing companies away from the historic financial district. The Port of New York was also in decline, as containerized shipping was making the city's traditional finger piers obsolete, and shipping activity was moving to New Jersey. David understood that without dramatic intervention, Lower Manhattan would continue its downward spiral, and his substantial investment in the area would lose value. He needed a catalyst, something so significant that it would reverse decades of decline and reestablish Lower Manhattan as a vibrant center of international commerce. The solution, David decided, would be an international trade center, a complex of buildings designed to facilitate global commerce and serve as a hub for businesses engaged in international trade. In 1962, he began quietly developing this vision, consulting with architects, city planners, and business leaders about what such a project might look like. His idea was influenced by several factors that were shaping the global economy at that time. The post-war period had seen an explosion in international trade. As European economies recovered and new markets opened across Asia and Latin America, American companies were expanding globally, and there was a growing need for office space designed specifically to house import-export firms, international banks, trade associations, and government agencies involved in regulating and promoting international commerce. David envisioned creating a specialized district, perhaps even a walled complex, where all these entities could be concentrated, making Lower Manhattan the undisputed capital of world trade, much as it was already the capital of American finance. But David Rockefeller, despite his immense personal wealth and influence, could not build such a massive project alone. He needed government support, public financing, and the power of eminent domain to acquire the land and displace the existing businesses. This is where the political machinery of New York came into play. David cultivated a close relationship with his brother Nelson Rockefeller, who had been elected governor of New York in 1958 and would serve in that role until 1973. Nelson was even more ambitious than David, a man who loved grand projects and saw architecture as a form of political expression. The two brothers made a formidable team, combining David's financial expertise and business connections with Nelson's political power and willingness to use government resources to achieve their shared vision. Together, they began strategizing about how to bring the World Trade Center from concept to reality. The key institution they would use was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, a bi-state agency created in 1921 to manage transportation infrastructure in the New York metropolitan area. By the early 1960s, the Port Authority had evolved into a powerful quasi-governmental organization, with the ability to issue bonds, raise revenue through tolls and fees, and exercise eminent domain. Crucially, the Port Authority operated with minimal democratic oversight, governed by commissioners appointed by the governors of New York and New Jersey rather than elected officials accountable to voters. David Rockefeller recognized that the Port Authority was the perfect vehicle for his World Trade Center project. If he could convince the agency to take on the development, the project would benefit from public financing, government powers to acquire land, and exemption from property taxes while still serving the Rockefeller vision of urban development. In 1962, David began his campaign to win over the Port Authority and key political leaders. He established the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, a business organization that he chaired and that served as a vehicle for promoting his vision for the area. Through this organization, he commissioned studies, produced reports, and generated publicity about the need for an international trade center. He argued passionately that New York was losing its position as the world's leading commercial city, that companies involved in international trade were scattered inefficiently across the metropolitan area, and that a centralized trade complex would create thousands of jobs, generate tax revenue, and restore Lower Manhattan's economic vitality. His message was carefully crafted to appeal to civic pride and economic anxiety, suggesting that without bold action, New York would be overtaken by other global cities. David's vision in 1962 was remarkably specific for such an early stage. He imagined not just office buildings, but a comprehensive complex that would include exhibition space for international trade shows, conference facilities, hotel accommodations for foreign business visitors, and perhaps even facilities for customs processing and trade documentation. He wanted to create a self-contained world where international commerce could flourish, where a businessman from Tokyo could meet with a trader from Buenos Aires, attend a trade exhibition, complete documentation, and arranged shipping, all within a single complex. This was an ambitious reimagining of how international trade could be conducted, reflecting David's belief that physical proximity and specialized facilities could give New York a competitive advantage in an increasingly interconnected global economy. It was this grand vision, born in 1962, that would eventually result in the Twin Towers rising from the streets of Lower Manhattan, forever changing not just the skyline, but the very nature of the city itself. How the Rockefeller family used financial power, banking networks, and political influence to fund and push the project. The story of how the Rockefeller family transformed a controversial idea into the most ambitious construction project in New York City's history is a masterclass in wielding power through the intricate combination of financial manipulation, political pressure, and institutional control. Between 1962 and 1973, the Rockefellers orchestrated a campaign that would make even the most seasoned political operators marvel at its sophistication and ruthlessness. David Rockefeller understood from the very beginning that building the World Trade Center would require more than just money. It would require the careful orchestration of multiple power centers, the manipulation of oppositions, the neutralization of opposition, and the creation of a financial structure so complex that by the time anyone understood what was happening, the project would already be too far advanced to stop. This was not the work of a single year or a single transaction, but rather a decade-long exercise in applied power that revealed exactly how America's elite families could bend entire cities to their will when they decided to deploy their full arsenal of influence. David Rockefeller's first and most important move was to ensure he had complete control over the intellectual and planning framework for the project. In 1958, even before the World Trade Center idea had fully crystallized, he had established the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, a private organization that he chaired and that was ostensibly a civic group concerned with the revitalization of Lower Manhattan. But this was no ordinary civic organization. It was funded almost entirely by David's Chase Manhattan Bank and other Rockefeller-connected institutions, and its board was packed with business leaders who owed their positions or their financing to Rockefeller interests. Through this organization, David commissioned a series of studies and reports from prestigious planning firms, spending hundreds of thousands of dollars to create what appeared to be independent expert analysis supporting the need for a massive trade center in Lower Manhattan. These reports, produced by firms like Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill, one of the nation's leading architectural practices, provided the intellectual ammunition for the project, arguing with charts and statistics and projections that without such a development, Lower Manhattan would continue its economic decline. What the public did not know was that David Rockefeller had personally selected the consultants, framed their questions, and in some cases even suggested their conclusions. This was manufactured consensus, expertly crafted to make the World Trade Center seem not like David Rockefeller's personal vision, but like an urgent civic necessity identified by independent experts. But David knew that private advocacy, no matter how well funded, could only take the project so far. He needed government power, specifically the ability to use public financing in eminent domain to acquire the 16 square blocks of Lower Manhattan where the Trade Center would be built. This is where his brother Nelson Rockefeller became absolutely crucial to the entire enterprise. Nelson had been elected governor of New York in 1958, and he brought to that office an almost manic enthusiasm for massive construction projects, having developed a philosophy that government should use its power to build monuments that would inspire citizens and demonstrate the vitality of the state. Nelson was not interested in small-scale improvements or incremental change. He wanted transformative projects that would bear his mark for centuries, and he saw the World Trade Center as exactly that kind of legacy-defining achievement. The two brothers met frequently throughout the early 1960s, sometimes at the family estate in Pocantico Hills, sometimes at David's office, coordinating their strategy with the precision of military planners. Nelson would provide the political muscle and the government machinery. David would provide the business justification and the private sector support. The key governmental vehicle they selected was the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, and this choice was nothing short of brilliant from a power perspective. The Port Authority was a peculiar beast in American governance, a bi-state agency that operated with enormous autonomy, wielding powers that normally belong to elected governments but answering to no electorate. It was governed by 12 commissioners, 6 appointed by the governor of New York and 6 by the governor of New Jersey, serving 6-year overlapping terms. These commissioners were invariably drawn from the business and legal elite, men who moved in the same circles as the Rockefellers and who shared their vision of development-driven progress. Even better, from the Rockefellers' perspective, the Port Authority had the power to issue bonds backed by its revenue from bridges, tunnels, and port facilities, meaning it could finance enormous projects without having to go through the normal legislative appropriations process. It also possessed the power of eminent domain, allowing it to seize private property for public purposes, and it was exempt from local zoning regulations and property taxes. In other words, the Port Authority was a mechanism by which the Rockefellers could access government power while avoiding democratic accountability. Nelson Rockefeller moved quickly to ensure the Port Authority would serve his purposes. He appointed commissioners who were sympathetic to the World Trade Center vision, and he worked closely with Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's executive director, who ran the agency like a private fiefdom and who saw the Trade Center as a way to expand his empire. But there was a significant obstacle. The Port Authority's mandate was to manage transportation infrastructure, not to build office towers, and there was considerable debate about whether constructing the World Trade Center fell within the agency's legal authority. The solution to this problem demonstrated the Rockefellers' ability to reshape institutional missions to suit their needs. Through a combination of legal maneuvering and political pressure, they engineered an interpretation of the Port Authority's charter that defined the Trade Center as a trade facilitation project, essentially a piece of economic infrastructure that would support the port's mission by making New York a more attractive center for international commerce. This was a stretch, to put it mildly, but with Nelson controlling the governor's office and David controlling the business community narrative, the reinterpretation went through. The financial structure of the project revealed the Rockefellers' sophisticated understanding of how to use public resources for private ends. The Port Authority would finance construction by issuing bonds, which would be repaid through rental income from the Trade Center's commercial tenants. This meant that theoretically the project would be self-financing and would not require taxpayer dollars. But this analysis ignored several crucial realities. First, the Port Authority's ability to issue bonds at favorable interest rates depended on its overall financial strength, which came from its monopoly control of revenue-generating bridges and tunnels. In effect, the motorists paying tolls to cross the George Washington Bridge were subsidizing the construction of David Rockefeller's dream project in Lower Manhattan. Second, the Trade Center would be exempt from property taxes that a private developer would have had to pay, representing an enormous hidden subsidy estimated at tens of millions of dollars per year. Third, the Port Authority's use of eminent domain allowed it to acquire land at below-market prices, forcing small business owners and property holders to sell at values determined by government appraisers rather than through voluntary market transactions. The Rockefellers had essentially created a mechanism to socialize the costs and risks of the project while privatizing the benefits, which would flow primarily to David's Chase Manhattan Bank and other large financial institutions that would anchor the complex. David Rockefeller's control over the banking industry gave him another crucial lever of power. As chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank, one of the world's largest financial institutions, he could influence which companies received favorable financing terms, which construction firms got lucrative contracts, and which developers could access the capital markets. Throughout the 1960s, David used these relationships ruthlessly to build support for the Trade Center. He made it clear to major corporations that Chase would look favorably on their financing needs if they committed to leasing space in the planned complex. He steered Port Authority legal work and financial advisory contracts to law firms and investment banks that supported the project. He used his position on numerous corporate boards to ensure that business leaders publicly endorsed the Trade Center concept. This was not crude quid pro quo corruption, but rather the subtle exercise of structural power, the ability to shape outcomes through the accumulated weight of financial relationships and implicit understandings about how favors would be remembered and reciprocated. The Rockefellers also demonstrated sophisticated media management throughout the campaign. David cultivated relationships with the publishers and editors of New York's major newspapers, hosting them for lunches, providing them with exclusive information and framing the Trade Center narrative in ways that made opposition seem backward-looking and obstructionist. The New York Times, whose publisher was a member of David's Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, provided consistently favorable coverage of the project, emphasizing job creation and economic revitalization while minimizing coverage of displaced businesses and neighborhood destruction. When criticism did appear, David's public relations team was quick to respond with carefully prepared rebuttals and expert testimonials. The Rockefellers understood that controlling the story was almost as important as controlling the financing. Why Lower Manhattan was chosen, and how the Port Authority took control in 1964 to 1966. The selection of Lower Manhattan as the site for the World Trade Center was not a neutral technical decision based purely on transportation logistics or geographic convenience, but rather a calculated strategic choice that reflected David Rockefeller's personal financial interests, the political ambitions of his brother Nelson, and the institutional imperatives of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. By 1964, when the Port Authority formally committed to the project, the question of where to build had already been answered through a process that favored power over democratic input, revealing how decisions that would affect millions of New Yorkers could be made by a small circle of elites meeting behind closed doors. The story of why Lower Manhattan was chosen and how the Port Authority seized control of the project between 1964 and 1966 is a tale of bureaucratic maneuvering, political deal-making, and the systematic marginalization of alternative voices, a process that transformed a struggling waterfront neighborhood into the most valuable real estate in the world while displacing thousands of small business owners who had no say in their own fate. When David Rockefeller first began promoting the idea of a World Trade Center in the early 1960s, the location was far from predetermined. In fact, the initial feasibility studies commissioned by his Downtown Lower Manhattan Association had examined several possible sites across the New York metropolitan area, including locations in Midtown Manhattan, along the Brooklyn waterfront, and even in New Jersey. Each location had distinct advantages. Midtown Manhattan already had superior transportation infrastructure and was where most corporate headquarters were located, which would have made attracting tenants easier. The Brooklyn waterfront offered cheaper land and the possibility of creating an entirely new commercial district. New Jersey locations would have pleased Port Authority commissioners from that state and avoided the political complications of New York City real estate. But David Rockefeller had already made his choice, and it was never really in doubt. The Trade Center would be built in Lower Manhattan, specifically on a superblock stretching from Church Street to West Street and from Vesey Street to Liberty Street, in the heart of an area known as Radio Row. The reasons for David's insistence on Lower Manhattan were transparently self-serving, though they were always couched in language about civic revitalization and economic development. David had made an enormous personal and institutional bet on Lower Manhattan when he convinced Chase Manhattan Bank to build its new headquarters at 1 Chase Manhattan Plaza, which opened in 1961. That 60-story tower represented the first major office building constructed in Lower Manhattan in decades, and it was intended to signal confidence in the financial district's future. But by the mid-1960s, it was becoming painfully clear that one building, no matter how impressive, could not reverse the area's decline. The neighborhood around Chase Plaza remained seedy and deteriorating, filled with aging buildings, obsolete shipping facilities, and small businesses that catered to a dwindling population of office workers. David needed a catalyst large enough to transform the entire district, and the World Trade Center was that catalyst. If the Trade Center could bring tens of thousands of office workers to Lower Manhattan every day, if it could attract prestigious corporate tenants and international organizations, if it could generate the kind of activity and prestige that would make the area desirable again, then David's investment in Chase Plaza would be protected and enhanced. This was not about what was best for New York City as a whole. This was about protecting and amplifying David Rockefeller's personal fortune and his bank's balance sheet. But David could not simply announce that the Trade Center would be built in Lower Manhattan to protect his investment. He needed to construct a public justification that would make the location choice seem inevitable and wise. This is where the Downtown Lower Manhattan Association-sponsored studies became crucial. Throughout 1962 and 1963, David commissioned reports from prestigious consulting firms that invariably concluded that Lower Manhattan was the ideal location for an international trade center. These reports argued that the financial district already had the infrastructure and institutional presence to support international commerce, that the site's proximity to the Battery and New York Harbor connected it symbolically and practically to the city's maritime history, and that building in Lower Manhattan would revitalize a historic area rather than consuming valuable land in already thriving districts. The reports conveniently ignored the fact that Lower Manhattan had terrible traffic congestion, limited subway access compared to Midtown, and was far from where most corporate executives lived in the northern suburbs. They also downplayed the massive disruption that would be caused by demolishing 16 square blocks of existing buildings and displacing hundreds of businesses. But these reports served their purpose. They created an aura of expert consensus that Lower Manhattan was the obvious and only sensible choice. The Port Authority's formal commitment to the project in 1964 represented the culmination of years of careful political cultivation by the Rockefeller brothers. Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's powerful executive director, had initially been skeptical of taking on the World Trade Center project, recognizing that it would be controversial and would stretch the agency's mission beyond its traditional focus on transportation infrastructure. But Nelson Rockefeller, as governor of New York, had the power to shape the Port Authority's Board of Commissioners, and throughout the early 1960s he systematically appointed individuals who were sympathetic to the trade center vision. These commissioners came from the same elite business and legal circles as the Rockefellers themselves, men who saw massive development projects as inherently good, and who trusted that David Rockefeller's judgment about Lower Manhattan's potential was sound. By 1964, Nelson had assembled a Port Authority board that was ready to approve the trade center, and Austin Tobin, recognizing which way the political winds were blowing and perhaps seduced by the prospect of managing the largest construction project in New York's history, dropped his objections and became an enthusiastic champion of the plan. The mechanism by which the Port Authority took control revealed the creative manipulation of governmental power. The agency's legal mandate was to operate transportation and terminal facilities in the Port District, a specific geographic area around New York Harbor. Constructing an office tower complex did not obviously fall within this mandate, and critics immediately challenged whether the Port Authority had the legal authority to proceed. The solution engineered by the Rockefellers and their lawyers was to redefine the World Trade Center as a trade facilitation facility, rather than simply an office building project. They argued that by concentrating businesses engaged in international trade, along with government agencies that regulated trade, customs brokers, freight forwarders, and international banks, the Trade Center would serve the port's mission by making New York a more efficient hub for global commerce. This was a significant expansion of how the Port Authority's mission had traditionally been understood. But with Nelson Rockefeller controlling the governor's office, and David Rockefeller controlling the business community narrative, the legal reinterpretation was accepted by the Port Authority's board in a vote that took place on March 8, 1964. From that moment forward, the Port Authority was officially in the real estate development business, and the World Trade Center had its governmental sponsor. The period from 1964 to 1966 saw the Port Authority consolidating its control over every aspect of the project while systematically eliminating potential obstacles. One of the first challenges was securing agreement from New Jersey, whose governor and Port Authority commissioners had to approve any major Port Authority initiative. New Jersey politicians and business leaders were understandably skeptical about why the Port Authority should invest billions of dollars in a New York City office complex, when that money could be spent on transportation improvements that would benefit New Jersey commuters or on economic development in New Jersey cities. The solution to this problem demonstrated the Rockefellers' willingness to engage in old-fashioned political horse trading. In exchange for New Jersey's support for the Trade Center, Nelson Rockefeller agreed to back the construction of a new commuter rail line connecting New Jersey to Manhattan, which the Port Authority would take over from the bankrupt Hudson and Manhattan Railroad. The design phase, Minoru Yamasaki, the Twin Towers concept, and the decision for a massive scale, the transformation of the World Trade Center from an abstract concept into a specific architectural vision, represents one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of American design. a story that reveals how aesthetic decisions about buildings are never purely about beauty or function, but are always deeply entangled with power, ego, ambition, and the desire to make statements that will echo across generations. In September 1962, the Port Authority selected a relatively unlikely figure to design what would become the most recognizable buildings in the world. Minoru Yamasaki, a Japanese-American architect from Detroit, who had never designed a skyscraper in New York and whose gentle, humanistic approach to architecture seemed utterly at odds with the brutal scale and commercial imperatives of the project he was being asked to undertake. The story of how Yamasaki developed the Twin Towers concept between 1962 and 1964, and how the decision was made to build on a scale so massive that it would overwhelm everything around it, is a tale of artistic compromise, engineering audacity, and the relentless pressure of clients who demanded nothing less than the tallest, largest, most spectacular buildings ever constructed, regardless of whether such monumentalism served any practical purpose or respected the human scale of the city. Minoru Yamasaki was an unusual choice for the World Trade Center Commission, and his selection revealed interesting tensions within the Port Authority and the Rockefeller Circle about what kind of statement the building should make. Born in Seattle in 1912 to Japanese immigrant parents, Yamasaki had risen to prominence in the 1950s with designs that emphasized delicacy, ornamentation, and what he called serenity in architecture, a philosophy that drew on both his Japanese heritage and his study of Gothic cathedrals. His most famous building at the time was the McGregor Memorial Conference Center at Wayne State University in Detroit, an elegant structure with decorative screens and reflecting pools that seemed to cultivate tranquility rather than project power. This was not the typical resume of an architect who would be asked to design the world's largest commercial complex, but Austin Tobin, the Port Authority's executive director, had been impressed by Yamasaki's recently completed design for the Federal Science Pavilion at the Seattle World's Fair, and perhaps more importantly, Tobin believed that Yamasaki's status as an outsider to New York's architectural establishment would make him more amenable to direction and less likely to impose his own artistic vision at the expense of the Port Authority's programmatic requirements. This was to be a project where the client's demands would dominate, and Tobin wanted an architect who would understand that dynamic from the beginning. When Yamasaki received the commission in September 1962, the parameters he was given were both thrilling and terrifying. Port Authority wanted between 8 million and 10 million square feet of office space, an almost incomprehensible amount that would make the trade center larger than any office complex in existence. They wanted the buildings to be taller than the Empire State Building, which had been the world's tallest building since 1931 and stood as the ultimate symbol of New York's architectural ambition. They wanted the project to make a statement about American power and New York's dominance in global commerce, to create a complex so impressive that businessmen from Tokyo to London would immediately recognize it and understand that this was the center of the capitalist world. And they wanted all of this to fit on a 16-acre superblock in Lower Manhattan, a site that was surrounded by narrow streets lined with 19th-century buildings that rose only 5 or 6 stories. Yamasaki understood immediately that whatever he designed would be utterly out of scale with its surroundings, that it would dominate and overshadow everything in the neighborhood, and that the human experience at street level would be profoundly affected by the massive shadows and wind patterns that such enormous structures would create. Yamasaki's initial response to these requirements revealed his discomfort with the scale being demanded. His first design proposal, presented in early 1963, called for a cluster of relatively smaller buildings, perhaps 70 or 80 stories each, arranged around a central plaza. This approach would have distributed the required office space across multiple structures, creating a more varied skyline and allowing more light to reach the street level. But the Port Authority rejected this concept almost immediately. Austin Tobin and his planning director Malcolm Levy made it clear that they wanted fewer, taller buildings, structures that would break records and capture headlines. The engineering consultants on the project, the firm of Worthington, Skilling, Helly, and Jackson from Seattle, had been experimenting with new structural systems that could support unprecedented heights, and both the Port Authority and the Rockefeller interests wanted to push the limits of what was technically possible. There was also a psychological dimension to the insistence on extreme height. David Rockefeller and his allies understood that in the world of urban development and corporate prestige, being the tallest mattered enormously. A building that was merely very tall would be forgotten, but a building that broke records would command attention and rent premium rates to tenants who wanted the status of working in the world's tallest towers. The Twin Towers concept emerged from this crucible of conflicting pressures sometime in late 1963. Yamasaki later claimed that the idea came to him during a sleepless night when he was struggling with how to accommodate the enormous square footage requirements while creating something architecturally coherent. The solution he proposed was elegant in its simplicity but radical in its implications. Instead of distributing the space across many smaller towers, he would concentrate it into two identical towers, each rising 110 stories and containing roughly 4 million square feet of office space. The towers would be twins, perfect mirrors of each other, standing side by side on the superblock and dominating the skyline in a way that no single building ever could. This twinning concept had powerful symbolic resonance, suggesting both competition and cooperation, duality and unity, and creating a visual signature that would be instantly recognizable from anywhere in the city. But the decision to build two towers instead of one also revealed the project's essential megalomania. 110 stories was far taller than necessary to accommodate the required office space on the available site. The Port Authority could have built shorter, wider buildings that would have been more efficient and more humane in their impact on the surrounding neighborhood. But efficiency and humanity were not the governing criteria. The governing criteria were spectacle, record-breaking, and the creation of monuments that would embody the Rockefeller Empire's vision of uncompromising ambition. The engineering challenges of building to such heights were formidable, and required innovations that would transform skyscraper design. Traditional skyscrapers used a steel frame with columns distributed throughout the building to support the weight of the structure and resist wind forces. But at the scale Yamasaki and the Port Authority were contemplating, this conventional approach would have resulted in interior spaces cluttered with columns, making the buildings difficult to rent and configure. The solution, developed by structural engineer Leslie Robertson and his colleagues, was revolutionary. A load-bearing exterior wall, essentially a steel mesh that would form a tube around the perimeter of each tower, supporting the building's weight and resisting wind forces while leaving the interior spaces column-free except for a central core containing elevators, stairwells, and mechanical systems. This tube frame design had never been attempted at such a scale, and it required calculations and testing that pushed the limits of 1960s engineering knowledge. The exterior walls would be clad in closely spaced vertical aluminum columns that would give the buildings their distinctive appearance while also serving a structural function. This meant that the tower's appearance was not decorative but integral to their engineering, a fusion of form and function that Yamasaki found aesthetically satisfying. But the decision to build on such a massive scale also reflected a particular moment in American history when bigger was assumed to be better, when technological prowess was celebrated without much consideration of its consequences, and when the voices questioning whether such monumentalism was appropriate or desirable were marginalized. The 1960s was the era of the Apollo program, of supersonic jets, of urban renewal projects that demolished entire neighborhoods to make way for modernist towers and highways. There was a prevailing belief among elites that technical experts and enlightened planners knew better than ordinary citizens what cities needed, and that resistance to progress was the province of sentimentalists who failed to understand the demands of the modern economy. Construction begins 1966-1968. Displacement of residents, destruction of small businesses, and public backlash. The demolition of Radio Row and the beginning of construction on the World Trade Center in 1966 marked one of the most brutal exercises of government power against small property owners in New York City's history, a process that laid bare the stark reality of how urban renewal actually functioned when stripped of its lofty rhetoric about progress and revitalization. On a cold morning in March 1966, workers employed by the Port Authority began the systematic destruction of a thriving commercial district that had existed for decades, forcibly removing business owners who refused to leave, smashing plate glass windows, ripping out electrical systems, and reducing buildings to rubble while their former occupants watched helplessly from behind police barricades. What transpired between 1966 and 1968 was not simply construction, but rather a collision between two entirely different visions of what cities were for. On one side stood David Rockefeller and the Port Authority, wielding the power of eminent domain and backed by the state's monopoly on violence, convinced that they were building a monument to international commerce that would benefit all New Yorkers. On the other side stood hundreds of small business owners, shop workers, and community members who understood that they were being sacrificed to satisfy the ambitions of the wealthy and powerful, and whose protests revealed deep fissures in the American consensus about development, property rights, and whose interests government was meant to serve. Radio Row was a neighborhood that few wealthy New Yorkers knew existed, but for those who worked there and shopped there, it was a vital and vibrant part of the city's commercial ecosystem. Stretching along Greenwich Street and Cortlandt Street in Lower Manhattan, Radio Row had emerged in the 1920s and 1930s as the center of New York's electronics trade. A chaotic jumble of small stores selling radio parts, war surplus electronics, vacuum tubes, resistors, capacitors, and every conceivable component needed to build or repair electronic equipment. By the early 1960s, there were more than 300 businesses operating in the area that would be demolished for the World Trade Center, employing thousands of people and serving customers from across the metropolitan area. These were not prestigious corporations or wealthy merchants, but rather immigrant entrepreneurs, many of them Jewish and Syrian, who had built businesses from nothing and who saw their shops as the embodiment of the American dream. The stores were cramped and dusty, their windows packed with merchandise, their owners often working 12 or 14-hour days, but they were profitable and they were theirs. These business owners had invested their life savings, raised their families on the income from these establishments, and had every reason to believe that their property rights would be respected and that government would not arbitrarily destroy what they had built. The Port Authority's use of eminent domain to seize the land for the World Trade Center revealed the enormous power imbalance between government agencies backed by wealthy interests and ordinary citizens trying to protect their livelihoods. Eminent domain, the government's power to take private property for public use, was originally intended for genuinely public purposes like building roads, schools, or parks, and was supposed to be used sparingly and only when property owners received just compensation. But in the urban renewal era of the 1960s, eminent domain had been expanded and twisted to serve development projects that primarily benefited private interests. The Port Authority argued that the World Trade Center was a public purpose because it would generate jobs and tax revenue and enhance New York's position in international commerce. But this was a thin justification for seizing hundreds of privately owned properties and transferring them to an agency that would build office towers to rent to private corporations. The business owners of Radio Row recognized this for what it was, the theft of their property under color of law, facilitated by the fact that they lacked the political connections and financial resources to fight back against an agency as powerful as the Port Authority backed by the Rockefeller family. The compensation offered to the displaced business owners demonstrated the Port Authority's contempt for their interests and its determination to acquire the land as cheaply as possible. Under eminent domain law, property owners are entitled to fair market value for their land and buildings, but determining fair market value is a subjective process controlled by government appraisers who have every incentive to lowball their estimates. The Port Authority hired its own appraisers who systematically undervalued the Radio Row properties, offering prices that reflected only the aging building's depreciated value without adequately compensating business owners for their lost goodwill, customer relationships, inventory, or the cost of relocating and reestablishing their businesses elsewhere. A store owner who had spent 30 years building a customer base and a reputation was offered perhaps $50,000 for a property that could never be replaced at that price, especially not in a city where commercial real estate values were already rising rapidly. Many business owners tried to negotiate for better terms, hiring their own appraisers and lawyers, but they quickly discovered that the Port Authority held all the cards. The agency could simply proceed with condemnation proceedings in court, where judges almost invariably sided with government agencies in eminent domain cases, especially when those agencies were represented by expensive law firms that the small business owners could never afford to match. The resistance that emerged in Radio Row between 1963 and 1966 represented one of the most determined grassroots campaigns against urban renewal in New York's history, even though it ultimately failed to stop the project. Led by a shopkeeper named Oscar Nadel, who owned a small electronics store and who emerged as the unlikely spokesman for the Radio Row merchants, the opposition organized demonstrations, filed lawsuits, lobbied politicians, and generated media coverage that challenged the Port Authority's narrative about the trade center's necessity. Nadel and his allies formed the Downtown West Businessmen's Association and hired lawyers to challenge the Port Authority's use of eminent domain, arguing that building an office complex did not constitute a legitimate public purpose, and that the agency was overstepping its legal authority. They held protest rallies outside the Port Authority's headquarters, carrying signs that read "Port Authority Robbery" and "Save Radio Row," trying to generate public sympathy and political pressure that might force the agency to reconsider or at least offer better compensation. They reached out to newspapers and television stations, giving interviews that humanized the story and presented the business owners not as obstacles to progress, but as hardworking Americans being crushed by an indifferent bureaucracy serving the interests of the super-rich. The media coverage of the Radio Row controversy revealed a fascinating divide in how different New Yorkers understood the conflict. The city's establishment newspapers, particularly the New York Times, generally supported the Port Authority and the Trade Center project, running editorials that emphasized the economic benefits and the need to modernize Lower Manhattan, while treating the displaced business owners with a kind of condescending sympathy that suggested their resistance was understandable but ultimately futile and misguided. These editorial positions were not surprising, given that the Times' publisher was a member of David Rockefeller's Downtown Lower Manhattan Association, and that the newspaper's leadership moved in the same elite circles as the project's sponsors. But smaller neighborhood newspapers and some columnists at the tabloids took a different view, portraying the Radio Row merchants as victims of government overreach, and questioning whether destroying a functioning commercial district to build more office space really served the public interest. These journalists interviewed business owners who had nowhere to go, who were too old to start over, who wept as they watched their stores being demolished, and their stories created a counter-narrative that challenged the triumphalist rhetoric of the project's promoters. The legal battle over the Trade Center reached its climax in 1963 when Oscar Nadel and other property owners filed a lawsuit challenging the Port Authority's right to use eminent domain for the project. Engineering challenges, safety concerns, asbestos use, windsway fears, and worker death controversies. The construction of the World Trade Center towers between 1968 and 1973 represented not only an architectural achievement but also a catalog of engineering compromises, safety shortcuts, and human tragedies that would haunt the buildings throughout their existence and contribute to the catastrophic loss of life when they finally collapsed on September 11, 2001. The men who designed and built the Twin Towers were pushing the boundaries of what was technically possible with 1960s materials and knowledge, constructing structures taller than any office buildings in history. And in their rush to break records and satisfy the demanding schedule imposed by the Port Authority, they made decisions that prioritized cost savings and construction speed over long-term safety and occupant protection. The story of the engineering challenges faced during construction reveals a disturbing pattern of calculated risk-taking, of warnings ignored or dismissed, of workers who died building monuments to someone else's ambition, and of the systematic use of materials, particularly asbestos fireproofing, that would later be recognized as deadly to anyone exposed to them. This was the dark underside of the gleaming vision that David Rockefeller and the Port Authority promoted to the public, a reality of broken bodies, compromised safety systems, and structural decisions made not by asking what was safest, but by asking what was cheapest and fastest. The fundamental engineering challenge of the Twin Towers stemmed from their unprecedented height and the revolutionary structural system that made that height possible. Leslie Robertson, the brilliant young structural engineer who served as the lead designer for the project, had developed the tube frame concept that would allow the towers to rise 110 stories without requiring interior columns that would obstruct the rentable floor space. This system concentrated the building's structural strength in the exterior walls, which consisted of closely spaced steel columns that formed a rigid perimeter tube, and in the central core that housed the elevators and mechanical systems. The floors would span between the exterior tube and the central core using lightweight trusses rather than traditional steel beams, a design that saved weight and money but that created what some engineers recognized even then as a potential vulnerability. If the exterior columns were damaged or if the floor trusses were compromised, the entire structural system could be jeopardized in ways that would not occur in conventionally framed buildings. But Robertson and his colleagues assured the Port Authority that their calculations were sound, that the buildings could withstand hurricanes, earthquakes, and even the impact of a Boeing 707, the largest commercial airliner in service at the time, though these assurances were based on theoretical models rather than any kind of physical testing that could validate their assumptions under real-world conditions. The wind sway issue emerged as one of the most technically challenging and psychologically disturbing aspects of the tower's design, forcing the engineers to confront the fact that buildings this tall would move perceptibly in strong winds, potentially terrifying occupants and causing damage to interior finishes and mechanical systems. Skyscrapers have always swayed in the wind, but at the height of the Twin Towers, the movement would be measurable in feet rather than inches, creating a slow oscillation that could last for hours during storms. Robertson's team calculated that the towers might sway as much as 3 feet from center in hurricane-force winds, a movement that would be imperceptible to most people but that could cause nausea and disorientation in sensitive individuals, and that raised concerns about the fatigue stress on structural connections that would be flexing constantly over the decades. The solution they developed involved installing massive dampers, essentially giant shock absorbers at the top of each tower, to reduce the swaying motion and designing the exterior columns to be slightly flexible while maintaining their strength. But these were experimental solutions at this scale, and there was genuine uncertainty about whether they would work as intended. Some engineers who consulted on the project privately expressed concerns that the buildings might develop a reputation as uncomfortable places to work if the swaying became noticeable, potentially affecting rental rates and the Port Authority's ability to recoup its investment. But these concerns were dismissed by project managers who insisted that the structural team had everything under control. The decision to use asbestos fireproofing throughout the towers would later be recognized as one of the most catastrophic choices made during construction, a decision that exposed thousands of workers and eventually contributed to the building's vulnerability to fire. In the 1960s, asbestos was widely used in construction because of its excellent fire-resistant properties and its low cost. And despite growing evidence of its health dangers, the construction industry continued to rely on it heavily. The World Trade Center towers were originally designed to have their steel structural elements sprayed with asbestos-containing fireproofing material that would insulate the steel from heat and prevent it from weakening in a fire. Hundreds of tons of this material were sprayed onto the steel framework during the first stages of construction, creating clouds of asbestos fibers that workers breathed in daily, coating their clothes and skin and settling throughout the construction site. The workers doing this spraying were often given minimal protective equipment, perhaps paper masks that did nothing to filter out microscopic asbestos fibers, and they had no real understanding of the long-term health consequences of their exposure. Many of these men would later develop mesothelioma, asbestosis, and other fatal respiratory diseases, dying slow and painful deaths decades after they built the towers. Victims of an industry that knew asbestos was dangerous but continued using it because it was cheap and effective, and because the people who made the decisions about what materials to use were not the people who would suffer the consequences of exposure. The controversy around asbestos use intensified in 1971 when New York City officials, responding to growing public awareness of asbestos dangers, banned the spraying of asbestos fireproofing in construction projects. By this time, the asbestos fireproofing had been applied to the steel framework up to the 64th floor of the North Tower, but the upper floors in the entire South Tower had not yet received this treatment. The Port Authority was forced to switch to an alternative fireproofing material, a mineral fiber product that was supposedly safer, but that had not been tested as extensively and whose fire-resistant properties were less well established. This created an unintended consequence. The Twin Towers ended up with 2 different fireproofing systems, with the lower floors of the North Tower protected by asbestos-based material, and the upper floors in the South Tower protected by the alternative mineral fiber. This inconsistency would later raise questions about whether the buildings had uniform fire protection and whether the areas with the alternative fireproofing were adequately protected, questions that became tragically relevant on September 11, 2001, when fires raged in the upper floors of both towers. Moreover, the presence of asbestos in the lower floors created a long-term maintenance and health problem, as any renovation or repair work that disturbed the asbestos fireproofing could release fibers into the air, requiring expensive abatement procedures and exposing workers and occupants to health risks. The human cost of constructing the Twin Towers was measured not just in future health consequences, but in immediate deaths and injuries that occurred with disturbing frequency throughout the construction process. Building skyscrapers has always been dangerous work, but the scale and complexity of the World Trade Center project, combined with the intense pressure to meet deadlines and control costs, created conditions where accidents were almost inevitable. Between 1968 and 1973, 60 workers died building the World Trade Center complex, a horrifying toll that included men who fell from great heights, were crushed by falling materials, were electrocuted or died in various other construction accidents. Completion in 1973, and why it is called the Rockefeller's last empire, the final peak of their influence. When the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center officially opened for business in 1973, with the North Tower completed in December 1970 and the South Tower finished in July 1973, though full occupancy and the dedication ceremony would not occur until April 1973. They represented the culmination of more than a century of Rockefeller ambition to shape American cities, economies, and institutions according to their vision of rational corporate-dominated progress. Standing 1,368 feet and 1,362 feet tall respectively, dominating the Manhattan skyline in a way that no buildings ever had before, the towers were David Rockefeller's ultimate achievement, the physical manifestation of his belief that private capital working through public agencies could transform urban space and create monuments that would endure for generations. But even as the champagne flowed at the dedication ceremony, and politicians praised the project as a symbol of New York's resilience and global leadership, perceptive observers recognized that the World Trade Center represented not the beginning of a new era of Rockefeller dominance, but rather the end of one, the last great project of a family whose influence had already begun its long decline. The towers would forever be known as the Rockefeller's last empire, because they were built at the precise historical moment when the economic, political, and cultural conditions that had enabled the Rockefellers to exercise such extraordinary power for 3 generations were beginning to dissolve. When the consensus around modernist urban planning was fracturing, when the faith in massive government-sponsored development projects was eroding, the dedication ceremony for the World Trade Center in April 1973 brought together the full pantheon of American power in the early 1970s, a gathering that revealed both the heights the Rockefeller family had reached and the fragility of the world they had helped create. Nelson Rockefeller, still serving as governor of New York and harboring ambitions for the presidency, presided over the ceremony with characteristic grandiosity, delivering a speech that positioned the towers as monuments to free enterprise and international cooperation, carefully avoiding any mention of the displaced businesses, the dead construction workers, or the billions of dollars in public debt that had been incurred to satisfy his brother's vision. David Rockefeller stood beside him, the chairman of Chase Manhattan Bank and the undisputed leader of the American business establishment, basking in the realization of a project he had first conceived more than a decade earlier. Also present were Mayor John Lindsay, Port Authority Executive Director Austin Tobin, who had wielded enormous power in making the project a reality, and representatives from corporations around the world who had leased space in the towers. The ceremony was covered by newspapers and television networks as a triumphant moment for New York, proof that the city could still build on a scale that inspired awe and demonstrated American technological prowess. What the celebrants could not see, or refused to acknowledge, was that they were presiding over the funeral of an era as much as the birth of a landmark. The World Trade Center is called the Rockefeller's last empire for several interconnected reasons that reveal the changing nature of American capitalism and political power in the 1970s and beyond. First and most obviously, it was literally the last massive construction project that the Rockefeller family would initiate and control. For 3 generations, from John D. Rockefeller Sr.'s construction of office buildings in the late 19th century through John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s development of Rockefeller Center in the 1930s to David and Nelson's World Trade Center in the 1960s and 1970s. The family had defined itself through monumental building projects that reshaped cities and created physical landmarks embodying their vision of progress. After the World Trade Center, the Rockefellers would never again sponsor a project of comparable scale or ambition. David would continue to be influential in banking and philanthropy until his death in 2017 at the age of 101. But his influence would be exercised through more conventional channels of corporate governance and charitable giving, rather than through the kind of audacious public-private partnerships that had produced the Trade Center. The era of families personally shaping urban development through massive construction projects was coming to an end, replaced by an age of diffuse corporate ownership, institutional investors, and real estate investment trusts that operated according to financial metrics rather than dynastic vision. Second, the World Trade Center marked the peak of the Rockefellers' ability to mobilize government power in service of their private interests, a form of influence that was becoming increasingly difficult to exercise in the more skeptical and democratically assertive political environment of the 1970s. The Trade Center had been made possible only through the Rockefellers' control over multiple levers of power simultaneously. Nelson's position as governor giving him authority over the Port Authority, David's position as the leading banker in New York giving him influence over the business community and the financial structure of the project, and the family's broader network of relationships with politicians, lawyers, architects, and journalists giving them the ability to shape public opinion and neutralize opposition. This kind of concentrated multidimensional power was already becoming anachronistic by the time the towers opened. The urban renewal consensus that had enabled projects like the Trade Center to sweep aside neighborhood opposition was collapsing in the face of community activism, environmental movements, and a growing skepticism about top-down planning. The Watergate scandal, which was unfolding at the exact moment the Trade Center was being completed, was eroding public trust in elite institutions and creating a political climate where the kind of backroom deals that had facilitated the Trade Center would face much more intense scrutiny and resistance. Third, the World Trade Center represented the culmination of a particular vision of modernist urbanism that was already being rejected by architects, planners, and the public by the early 1970s. The towers embodied the principles that had dominated American architecture and planning since World War II. Monumental scale, rational efficiency, technological optimism, and a belief that cities should be organized around the needs of corporations and automobiles rather than the preferences of residents and pedestrians. But by 1973, this modernist orthodoxy was under fierce attack from critics like Jane Jacobs, whose book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, had exposed the failures of urban renewal and championed the messy vitality of traditional neighborhoods over the sterile order of modernist megaprojects. The Towers Plaza, a vast windswept expanse of concrete that most people hurried across as quickly as possible rather than lingering in, perfectly illustrated what had gone wrong with modernist urban design. The buildings themselves, with their repetitive facades and overwhelming mass, were increasingly seen as inhuman and alienating rather than inspiring. Architecture was moving toward postmodernism, toward designs that embraced historical reference, human scale, and contextual sensitivity, all values utterly absent from the World Trade Center. In this sense, the towers were born obsolete, representing the final flowering of an architectural ideology that was already dying. Fourth, and perhaps most profoundly, the World Trade Center's completion coincided with the beginning of a fundamental transformation in the American and global economy that would eventually erode the kind of corporate capitalism the Rockefellers had dominated. The early 1970s marked the end of the post-war economic boom that had created unprecedented prosperity for American corporations and workers. The oil crisis of 1973, which began just months after the Trade Center opened, shattered assumptions about endless economic growth and American dominance. The Bretton Woods system of fixed exchange rates collapsed, introducing new volatility into international finance.